They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, mine took 37 years to prepare, and when I finally served it, it was absolutely frozen. Hello there, my dear friends. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 65 years old now, sitting here in my cozy kitchen in Portland, Oregon, looking back at a life that reads like something out of a horror novel. But unlike those stories, this one has an ending that will make you believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe does keep score. Today, I'm going to tell you something I've never told another living soul. Not my husband of 30 years, not my children, not even my therapist. It's a story about monsters who wore the faces of family, about a little girl who learned to survive in hell, and about how that same little girl grew up to become the architect of the most perfect revenge you could ever imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was born in 1959 in Millfield, a forgotten industrial town in western Pennsylvania, where the steel mills had been dying a slow death for decades. Our house sat on Elm Street, a narrow two-story building with peeling white paint and a front porch that sagged like a tired old man's shoulders. From the outside, we looked like any other working-class family struggling to make ends meet. But inside those four walls lived a darkness so complete that even now, all these years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, remembering. My father, Robert Thompson, was a large man with hands like baseball mitts and a temper that could explode without warning. He worked at the remaining steel mill when there was work to be had, which wasn't often in those days. When he wasn't working, he was drinking. And when he was drinking, which was most of the time, he became something that shouldn't have been allowed to exist in the same world as children. My mother, Linda, was a ghost of a woman who had learned long ago that survival meant becoming invisible. She worked double shifts at the local diner, coming home exhausted and broken, her eyes always focused on some distant point beyond our reality. I used to think she stayed away so much because she was trying to support us. It took me years to realize she was really just trying to escape. But the real nightmare began when my father's brothers started coming around more often. Uncle Danny, the youngest of the three Thompson men, was thin as a rail with nervous energy that made him pace around our house like a caged animal. Uncle Mike, the middle brother, was built like my father but meaner, with dead eyes that seemed to see right through you to something ugly on the other side. Together, the three Thompson brothers created an atmosphere of fear so thick you could practically taste it. I was 7 years old when it started. 7 years old, still believing that adults were supposed to protect children, still thinking that family meant safety. I had long brown hair that my mother would braid every morning before school, and I wore hand-me-down dresses that were always a little too big. I was a quiet child, the kind teachers described as well-behaved, without really seeing the fear that kept me so still and silent. My younger brother Tommy was 5, a sweet boy with our mother's gentle nature and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. He had no idea what was coming, neither did I. It began on a Wednesday evening in November. I remember because it was the day before Thanksgiving, and I had spent the afternoon at school making paper turkeys with orange and brown construction paper. I was excited to show them to my family, proud of my artwork in the way only a 7-year-old can be. The house was different when I got home that day. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made my stomach feel funny. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with both my uncles, empty beer bottles scattered around them like soldiers after a battle. They were talking in low voices, but they stopped when I walked in. "There's our little princess," Uncle Danny said, his voice different somehow, thicker. "Come here and give your uncle a hug." I obeyed, because in our house, you always obeyed. But when he hugged me, his hands lingered in places they shouldn't have, and he held me too tight for too long. I tried to pull away, but his grip was stronger than it looked. Such a pretty little girl, Uncle Mike commented from across the table, his dead eyes fixed on me in a way that made my skin crawl. Going to be a real beauty when she grows up. My father laughed, a sound that had no humor in it. She's got her mother's looks, that's for sure. Too bad she'll probably end up with her mother's backbone, too. I didn't understand what they meant then, but I understood the feeling in the room. It was like standing too close to a fire, knowing you were about to get burned but being too scared to move away. That night, after Tommy and I had been sent to bed, I heard them downstairs, their voices getting louder as the drinking continued. They were talking about things that made my stomach hurt, using words I didn't know but somehow understood were wrong. I pulled my blanket over my head and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. My bedroom door creaked open, and a shaft of hallway light fell across my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to pretend I was asleep, but pretending couldn't protect me from what came next. "I know you're awake, sweetheart," came my father's voice, slurred and dangerous. "Your old daddy just wants to tuck you in proper." What happened in the following minutes shattered something inside me that would never fully heal. My father's rough hands, the weight of him on my small bed, his whiskey breath in my face as he told me this was our special secret and that good little girls don't tell tales. When it was over and he stumbled back to his own room, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my 7-year-old mind trying to process something too horrible to understand. I hurt in ways I had no words for, and I was terrified in ways that went deeper than any monster under the bed. But that was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, it became a routine. My father would visit my room several times a week, each time leaving me more broken than before. And then, as if one monster wasn't enough, my uncles began taking turns too. Uncle Danny with his nervous energy and wandering hands, Uncle Mike with his cold efficiency and complete lack of anything resembling human compassion. They had a system. They coordinated their visits, made sure my mother was working her late shifts, ensured Tommy was asleep. They treated my childhood like a commodity to be shared among themselves, and they did it with the casual cruelty of men who saw nothing wrong with destroying something innocent for their own pleasure. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though that was considerable. The worst part was the way they made me complicit in my own destruction. They convinced me, through a combination of threats and twisted logic, that I was somehow responsible, that I was the one doing something wrong, that if anyone found out, I would be the one in trouble. "Who's going to believe a little girl over 3 grown men?" Uncle Mike would whisper after he was finished with me. "They'll say you're making it up for attention. They'll send you away to one of those places for bad children." They told me what would happen to Tommy if I ever said anything, how he would end up in foster care, how we'd be separated forever, how it would be all my fault. They painted pictures, with their words of scenarios so terrifying that keeping their secret seemed like the only way to protect the one person in the world I truly loved. My brother Tommy remained innocent through those early months, too young to understand the change in me, the way I'd started flinching at unexpected touches, the way I'd begun wetting the bed again. He would crawl into my bed some nights when he had bad dreams, and I would hold him close, promising silently that I would never let them hurt him the way they hurt me. School became my only refuge, the one place where I could pretend to be a normal little girl. But even there, the effects of what was happening at home began to show. My grades started slipping. I stopped participating in class. I developed a stutter that hadn't been there before. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, would sometimes keep me after class to ask if everything was okay at home, but the words would stick in my throat like concrete. The threat of what would happen if I told was always louder than any concern an adult might show. Winter turned to spring, and the abuse continued with the regularity of changing seasons. My 8th birthday passed without celebration. My mother was working, and my father and uncles were too drunk to remember. I sat alone in my room that night, looking at my reflection in the small mirror above my dresser, and I made a promise to myself that I was too young to fully understand. Someday, I whispered to my reflection, someday they would pay for what they had done. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but somewhere in my 8-year-old heart, a seed of something dark and patient began to grow. I couldn't have imagined then that it would take nearly 4 decades for that seed to fully bloom, or that when it did, the harvest would be sweeter than anything I could have dreamed of as a broken little girl in a house full of monsters. But patience, I would learn, is the most powerful weapon a survivor can possess. And I was nothing if not a survivor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time I turned 9, I had learned to read the house like a weather forecast. I could tell by the way my father's keys jingled when he came through the front door, whether it would be a quiet night or one of the nights when I'd need to disappear into myself completely. I could predict Uncle Danny's visits by the way he'd start showing up for dinner more frequently, his nervous energy crackling like electricity before a storm. Uncle Mike was the most predictable of all. He came every other Friday, like clockwork, treating his visits like some twisted business appointment. What I hadn't anticipated was how Tommy would start to notice things. My little brother had always been observant, but as he grew from 5 to 6 to 7 years old, his questions became more pointed, more dangerous. He'd ask why I always seemed scared on Friday nights, why I'd started keeping a chair propped against my bedroom door, why I sometimes limped to breakfast on Saturday mornings, claiming I'd fallen out of bed. "Maggie," he said one morning as we walked to school together, his small hand finding mine. "Are you sick? You look tired all the time now." I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "I'm fine, Tommy. Just growing up, I guess. Growing up makes you tired sometimes." But Tommy was too smart for his own good. He'd inherited our mother's intuition along with her gentle heart, and both qualities made him dangerous to the carefully constructed lies that kept our household functioning. The first time he almost caught them was on a Tuesday night in October. I was 10 by then, and the abuse had evolved into something more systematic, more organized. My father and uncles had developed what they called the schedule, a rotation that ensured I was never given enough time to heal completely between visits, never allowed to forget my place in their twisted hierarchy. That particular night, it was Uncle Danny's turn. He'd been drinking since dinner, his nervous energy amplified by whiskey until he was practically vibrating with anticipation. I'd gone to bed early, as I'd learned to do on his nights, hoping that if I pretended to be asleep deeply enough, maybe he'd change his mind. He didn't. I was in the middle of trying to float away from my body, to find that safe place in my mind, where nothing could touch me, when I heard it, the soft creak of Tommy's bedroom door opening across the hall. My blood turned to ice. Tommy was a light sleeper, and sometimes he'd get up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. Uncle Danny heard it too. He froze, his weight still pinning me to the mattress, his hand clamped over my mouth. We both listened as Tommy's bare feet padded across the hallway floor. The bathroom door opened and closed. The toilet flushed. Water ran in the sink. "Stay quiet," Uncle Danny hissed in my ear, his breath reeking of whiskey and something rotten. "Not a sound or your little brother's going to see something that'll scar him for life." Tommy's footsteps started back toward his room, but then they stopped. Right outside my door. "Maggie?" His voice was soft, confused. "Are you okay?" I heard something. Uncle Danny's grip on me tightened. I could feel his panic in the tension of his muscles, see the wild look in his eyes that told me he was capable of anything to keep his secret safe, including hurting Tommy. "I'm fine," I managed to whisper through his fingers. "Just had a bad dream. Go back to bed." There was a long pause. I could picture Tommy standing there in his Superman pajamas, his 7-year-old mind trying to process the wrongness he could sense but couldn't name. "Okay," he finally said, but his voice carried doubt. "Good night, Maggie." "Good night, Tommy." His footsteps retreated. His door closed. Uncle Danny waited another full minute before he resumed what he'd started, but the interruption had changed something. There was a new desperation in his movements, a fear that matched my own. For the first time, I realized that they were just as terrified of being discovered as I was of the consequences of discovery. That realization planted another seed alongside the one that promised future revenge. This seed whispered of power, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as helpless as they wanted me to believe. The next morning, Tommy watched me more carefully than usual. He noticed how I winced when I sat down for breakfast. He saw the way I avoided Uncle Danny's eyes when he stumbled downstairs, hungover and ashamed. Most importantly, he observed the way Uncle Danny couldn't quite meet anyone's gaze, how he made excuses to leave earlier than he normally would. "Uncle Danny seemed sick last night," Tommy commented innocently over his bowl of cereal. "I heard him making weird noises." My father's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Uncle Danny's face went pale. I felt the familiar knot of terror in my stomach, the fear that Tommy's innocent observation would somehow trigger the very consequences they'd always threatened. "People make all kinds of noises when they're drunk," my father said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Doesn't mean anything." But it did mean something. It meant Tommy was starting to piece together a puzzle he was too young to understand, but old enough to sense was important. Over the following weeks, I watched my little brother begin his own transformation. The happy, carefree child he'd been started to show cracks of anxiety and confusion. He'd ask me questions I couldn't answer, make observations that cut too close to the truth, offer comfort for hurts he couldn't comprehend. One evening, as we sat in our shared homework space at the kitchen table, the one room in the house where I felt relatively safe because it was visible from the front windows, Tommy looked up from his coloring book and said something that nearly stopped my heart. "Maggie, do daddies ever do bad things to their kids?" My pencil snapped in my hand. "Why would you ask that?" Jimmy Morrison at school said his dad hits him sometimes when he's drunk, but Jimmy said there are worse things than hitting. Tommy's innocent eyes searched my face. "What things are worse than hitting?" I stared at my little brother, this pure soul who still believed the world was fundamentally good, and I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could tell him the truth and shatter his innocence forever, or I could lie and hope that somehow I could protect him from learning what I knew. "I don't know," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Maybe Jimmy's just making up stories, but Tommy was too smart for that explanation, and we both knew it. The real crisis came in the spring, just after my 11th birthday. Tommy had turned 8, and his questions had become more direct, his observations more pointed. He'd started having nightmares, waking up screaming about monsters that looked like people we knew. My mother, when she was home long enough to notice, attributed it to an overactive imagination. My father and uncles said nothing, but I could see the worry in their eyes. It was Uncle Mike who finally decided something had to be done about Tommy's growing awareness. "The kid's getting too smart for his own good," he said one evening when they thought I was upstairs. I was actually hidden in the coat closet near the kitchen, a hiding spot I'd discovered that let me overhear their planning sessions. "He's asking too many questions." "He's just a kid," my father protested, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Kids forget things." "Not this kid," Uncle Danny added, his nervous energy making his voice shake. "He's been watching us. Really watching. Last week he asked me why I always go upstairs when his mommy's not home. What am I supposed to say to that?" "We need to expand the arrangement," Uncle Mike said, his cold voice cutting through the other. "Two like a knife. Include the boy. That way he can't talk without implicating himself. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound I'd ever heard. They were talking about destroying Tommy's innocence the way they'd destroyed mine. They were planning to turn my sweet, gentle little brother into another victim of their systematic cruelty. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities and plans. I was 11 years old, barely more than a child myself, but I had something my brother didn't have. Knowledge of how evil worked, understanding of the depths these men could sink to, and most importantly, time to prepare. I began to watch them the way they watched us. I learned their schedules, their habits, their weaknesses. I discovered that Uncle Danny kept a diary hidden in his car's glove compartment, documenting things that would destroy him if they ever came to light. I found out that Uncle Mike had been stealing money from the mill's petty cash, small amounts that hadn't been noticed yet but would add up to a felony if discovered. I learned that my father had been collecting disability payments for a back injury that had supposedly healed years ago. Each piece of information was a small weapon in an arsenal I was building for a war I couldn't yet imagine fighting. But I was patient. I was learning. And most importantly, I was planning. Because one thing had become crystal clear to me as I lay in that closet, listening to them plan my brother's destruction. They had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the length a sister would go to protect the one person in the world she truly loved. They were about to learn just how far that really was. The next day, I made a decision that would change everything. I told Tommy we needed to have a talk, a real talk, about things that grown-ups didn't usually discuss with children. I was going to tell him enough of the truth to protect him, without telling him so much that it would destroy him. What I didn't know was that Tommy had already figured out more than I thought possible, and what he told me in that conversation would set in motion a chain of events that wouldn't reach their conclusion for 30 more years. But when they did reach their conclusion, it would be spectacular. I chose the old oak tree behind Morrison's grocery store for our conversation. It was far enough from home that we couldn't be overheard, but close enough that our absence wouldn't raise questions if we were gone too long. Tommy sat cross-legged in the grass, picking at dandelions while I struggled to find words for truths that should never have to be spoken to an 8-year-old. "Tommy," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything. Once you know, you can't unknow it. Are you sure you want to hear this?" My little brother looked up at me with those clear, trusting eyes that still held traces of the innocence I was about to shatter. "I already know something bad is happening, Maggie. I've known for a long time. I just didn't know what to call it." The simple wisdom in his words hit me like a physical blow. Of course he knew. How could he not? He lived in the same house, breathed the same poisoned air, felt the same tremors of fear that shook our foundation every single day. "Dad and Uncle Danny and Uncle Mike," I said carefully, watching his face for signs that I should stop. "They've been hurting me. Not like hitting or yelling. Worse than that. Much worse." Tommy's small hand stilled on the dandelion he'd been destroying. "I know," he said quietly. "I hear you crying at night sometimes, after they leave your room. The matter-of-fact way." He said it broke something inside me that I didn't even know was still holding together. My 8-year-old brother had been carrying this knowledge alone, trying to process horrors that grown men struggled to comprehend. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Because I was scared they'd hurt you worse if they knew I knew." He looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than they should have been. "And because I was scared they'd start doing it to me, too." "They want to," I told him, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had broken. I heard them, talking. "They think you're getting too smart, asking too many questions. Uncle Mike wants to make you part of it." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his small fingers working methodically to tie dandelion stems together. What do we do? He asked finally. The question hung in the air between us like a bridge we were both afraid to cross. What could we do? We were children, 11 and 8 years old, trapped in a house with 3 adult men who had all the power, all the authority, all the physical strength. Who would believe us? Who would protect us? Who would choose 2 broken kids over 3 respected members of the community? I've been thinking about that, I said slowly. And I think we have to protect ourselves. But we have to be smart about it. Smarter than they think we can be. Tommy finished his dandelion chain and draped it around his neck like a necklace. What do you mean? I mean we learn everything we can about them. Their secrets, their weaknesses, their mistakes. We document everything, keep records, gather evidence, and then, when we're old enough and strong enough, we use it. Use it how? I looked at my little brother, this beautiful soul who deserved a childhood filled with laughter and games and scraped knees from playground adventures. And I told him, something that would bind us together in a conspiracy that would last the rest of our lives. We destroy them, Tommy, completely and utterly. We take everything from them the way they took everything from us. Tommy considered this with the seriousness of a general planning a military campaign. How long will that take? I don't know. Years? Maybe decades. But we'll wait as long as it takes. He nodded solemnly, as if we'd just agreed to share lunch money rather than plan a multi-decade revenge scheme. Okay. What do we do first? What we did first was establish our own system of communication and documentation. Tommy, it turned out, had inherited more than just our mother's intuition. He had a photographic memory that could recall conversations, dates, and details with startling accuracy. I had developed what I called invisible skills, the ability to move through the house undetected, to overhear conversations from hidden positions, to observe without being observed. Together, we created what we called the file, a collection of notebooks, photographs, and recorded evidence that we hid in a waterproof box buried beneath the oak tree where we'd had our first real conversation. Every week, we'd meet there to share what we'd learned, to add new evidence to our collection, to refine our understanding of the monsters we lived with. Tommy's contribution was remarkable. His innocent questions had taught him more about our tormentors than I'd learned in years of suffering at their hands. He knew that Uncle Danny had been stealing prescription medications from his job at the pharmacy and selling them to high school kids. He'd discovered that Uncle Mike had been having an affair with Mrs. Henderson from down the street, whose husband worked double shifts at the mill. He'd even figured out that our father had been collecting workers' compensation for a supposedly debilitating back injury while secretly working construction, jobs for cash under a fake name. My contributions were darker, but equally valuable. I knew their schedules, their preferences, their particular cruelties. I understood the psychological games they played, the threats they used to maintain control, the specific ways they justified their actions to themselves. Most importantly, I had begun to recognize patterns in their behavior that could be predicted and potentially exploited. But the most valuable thing we discovered was something neither of us had expected. We weren't their only victims. It was Tommy who first noticed the correlation. During one of our weekly meetings, he mentioned seeing Uncle Danny talking to Jenny Martinez, a girl from his class whose father had recently died in a mill accident. Jenny had been acting strange lately, Tommy said, jumpy and quiet with new bruises that she couldn't explain. You think Uncle Danny is doing to her what they do to you? Tommy asked. The possibility had never occurred to me, but once he said it, the pieces began falling into place. Uncle Danny's unexplained absences, his nervous energy around certain families in town, the way he'd volunteered to help out several single mothers whose husbands had died in various accidents. We began watching more carefully, expanding our surveillance beyond our own household. What we discovered was a network of abuse that reached far beyond our family. Uncle Mike had been preying on the daughters of families who owed him money. Our father had been targeting the children of women he met at the unemployment office, families who were too desperate and powerless to complain. Each new discovery was added to the file, but it also added weight to a growing sense of responsibility. We weren't just planning revenge for ourselves anymore. We were potentially the only hope for a dozen other children who were suffering the same horrors we endured. The scope of our mission had expanded beyond personal vengeance into something that felt almost heroic, but it also made everything more complex and dangerous. We couldn't just disappear and start new lives somewhere else. Too many other victims would be left behind. We couldn't go to the authorities without rock-solid evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. And we couldn't act rashly, without considering the consequences for every child whose safety depended on our success. So we waited, and planned, and gathered evidence. Tommy developed an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time to overhear crucial conversations. He befriended the children of other victims, learning their stories and documenting their suffering. He even managed to get his hands on some of Uncle Danny's stolen prescription pads, photographing them before returning them to their hiding place. I focused on the financial crimes and the more sophisticated cover-ups. I learned to pick locks and gained access to their personal papers. I discovered bank accounts they thought were secret, insurance policies they'd taken out on family members, legal documents that revealed the full extent of their criminal enterprises. By the time I turned 13 and Tommy was 10, the file had grown into multiple boxes containing enough evidence to destroy all three men multiple times over. But we still weren't ready to act. We were still children, still dependent on them for food and shelter, still vulnerable to their retaliation if our activities were discovered. That's when Tommy came up with the idea that would change everything. What if we don't wait until we're grown up, he said during one of our oak tree meetings. What if we find a way to get them to destroy each other? The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to build a case against them from the outside, we could use their own greed, paranoia, and mutual distrust to turn them against each other. All we had to do was plant the right seeds of suspicion and watch their alliance crumble from within. How? I asked, my mind already racing with possibilities. Tommy grinned, and for a moment he looked like the mischievous little boy he should have been allowed to be. Remember what Uncle Mike said about Uncle Danny skimming money from their business arrangements? And how Uncle Danny thinks Uncle Mike is planning to cut him out, and how Dad thinks they're both planning to frame him if anything goes wrong. I did remember. Those conversations had been some of our most valuable intelligence-gathering sessions. What if they all found out what the others were really thinking? Tommy continued. What if they discovered that none of them trusted the others as much as they pretended to? It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, and it was being proposed by a 10-year-old boy who should have been worried about spelling tests and playground games instead of orchestrating the downfall of 3 adult predators. But it was also perfect. We spent the next 6 months implementing what we called the betrayal protocol. We fed each man carefully crafted pieces of information that made the others look treacherous and untrustworthy. We forged documents that suggested secret meetings and private deals. We planted evidence that made each one think the others were planning to eliminate him from their arrangement. The beauty of it was that we didn't have to lie. Everything we told them was based on real conversations we'd overheard, real evidence we'd collected, real betrayals that were already simmering beneath the surface of their partnership. We just accelerated the timeline and amplified the suspicions that were already there. By my 14th birthday, the 3 men who had once terrorized us with their unified front were barely speaking to each other. The systematic abuse that had defined our childhood was falling apart as they became too focused on protecting themselves from each other to maintain their coordinated assault on us. But that was just the beginning. The real revenge was still decades away, and when it finally came, it would be more complete and more devastating than anything they could have imagined. Because Tommy and I had learned something important during those years of planning and waiting. The best revenge isn't served hot or cold. It's served with patience, precision, and an understanding that true justice sometimes takes a lifetime to achieve. The first crack in their alliance appeared on a cold February morning when I was 14. Uncle Danny came storming into our kitchen, his usual nervous energy amplified into something approaching rage. His thin face was flushed red from the cold and something else, fury that had been building for weeks. "Where is he?" Uncle Danny demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "Where's Mike?" My father looked up from his coffee, already defensive. "How the hell should I know? I'm not his keeper." "Well, somebody better find him because I just got off the phone with Carla Henderson. Seems her husband found some very interesting photographs in Mike's car last night." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Tommy and I exchanged the briefest of glances. We knew exactly what photographs Uncle Danny was talking about, because we'd made sure Mr. Henderson would find them. It had taken Tommy 3 weeks to figure out Uncle Mike's pattern with Mrs. Henderson. Every Tuesday and Thursday, when her husband worked the late shift, Uncle Mike would park his car behind the abandoned gas station on Maple Street and walk the back way to the Henderson house. Tommy had followed him twice, confirming the affair we'd suspected for months. The photographs had been the easy part. Uncle Mike was careless, arrogant in his belief that no one would dare challenge him. He'd left his camera in plain sight on his dashboard, never imagining that 2 children might have the skills and motivation to retrieve it, develop the film, and strategically place copies where they'd do the most damage. "What kind of photographs?" my father asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The kind that get a man killed by an angry husband," Uncle Danny snarled. "The kind that could bring attention we don't need. The kind that could destroy everything we've built here." Uncle Danny began pacing around our small kitchen like a caged animal, his agitation making the floorboards creak under his nervous steps. "I told you this would happen. I told you Mike was getting too sloppy, too confident. But did you listen?" "No, you said I was being paranoid." My father's jaw tightened, a warning sign Tommy and I had learned to recognize years ago. "Don't start pointing fingers, Danny. We've all made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Uncle Danny's voice cracked with incredulous laughter. "This isn't a mistake, Robert. This is sabotage. Someone wanted those photos found. Someone's been watching us, learning our routines, documenting our business." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. For a terrifying moment, I thought Uncle Danny had figured out what Tommy and I were doing. But then he continued, and I realized his paranoia was pointed in a completely different direction. "I think Mike's been setting us up from the beginning," Uncle Danny said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Think about it. Who suggested we expand operations beyond family? Who insisted we needed to be more systematic about everything? Who's been pushing for more documentation of our activities?" I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Every word Uncle Danny spoke was technically true. Uncle Mike had been the driving force behind systematizing their abuse network. But what Uncle Danny didn't understand was that we'd been carefully feeding him information and interpretations that led him to the exact conclusion we wanted him to reach. My father was quiet for a long moment, his thick fingers drumming against the chipped surface of our kitchen table. "You think Mike's working with someone? Law enforcement?" "I think Mike's covering his own ass," Uncle Danny replied. "And he's planning to throw us under the bus when the time comes." That afternoon, Tommy and I held an emergency meeting at our oak tree. The first phase of the betrayal protocol was working even better than we'd hoped, but we needed to be careful not to push too hard too fast. "Did you see Dad's face when Uncle Danny was talking?" Tommy asked, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He looked scared. "Good," I replied, checking to make sure no one could overhear us. "Scared people make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, they create opportunities for us." Over the following weeks, we watched the paranoia spread like a virus through their group. Uncle Danny became convinced that Uncle Mike was planning to frame him for the stolen prescription drugs. Uncle Mike grew suspicious that Uncle Danny was skimming money from their shared victims and planning to disappear with the profits. My father began to worry that both his brothers were preparing to eliminate him entirely and claim his territory for themselves. The beauty of it was that none of their suspicions were entirely wrong. Each man had been harboring thoughts of betrayal for months, weighing the benefits of eliminating his partners against the risks of going it alone. We hadn't created their mutual distrust. We'd simply given it permission to bloom. But the real breakthrough came when Tommy discovered Uncle Danny's insurance policy. It happened by accident, as the best intelligence often does. Tommy had been helping Uncle Danny move some boxes from his car to the basement, a chore that gave him access to spaces and conversations he wouldn't normally be privy to. While carrying a particularly heavy box, Tommy had stumbled and dropped it, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Among the scattered papers was a document that made Tommy's blood run cold, a detailed written account of every crime the three men had committed over the past 7 years, complete with dates, victims' names, and photographic evidence. It was Uncle Danny's insurance policy, his guarantee that if anything happened to him, his brothers would go down with him. But more importantly, it was evidence of crimes we'd never suspected, victims we'd never identified, and a scope of abuse that extended far beyond anything we'd imagined. There are 43 children on that list, Tommy told me during our next meeting, his voice hollow with shock. 43 kids in this town and 3 others nearby, some as young as 5 years old. The weight of that revelation hit me like a physical blow. We'd known they were monsters, but we hadn't understood the true scale of their monstrosity. 43 children. 43 families destroyed. 43 futures stolen by 3 men who saw other people's children as commodities to be consumed. Where's the document now? I asked. Back in Uncle Danny's box, exactly where he left it. But I memorized every word. Tommy's photographic memory, which had seemed like a useful quirk when we started gathering evidence, had become something closer to a superpower. And I know where he keeps the box. That document changed everything. It wasn't just evidence of their crimes. It was a weapon that could destroy all 3 men instantly if it ever saw the light of day. But more importantly, it proved that Uncle Danny was already planning for the possibility of mutual destruction. We began the second phase of our plan immediately. Using information from Uncle Danny's insurance document, we started leaving anonymous tips for Uncle Mike and my father about things Uncle Danny had done that weren't part of their shared activities. We made sure Uncle Mike discovered that Uncle Danny had been operating independently, victimizing children from families that weren't part of their agreed-upon territory. Simultaneously, we fed Uncle Danny information suggesting that Uncle Mike and my father were planning to cut him out of their arrangement entirely. We forged documents that seemed to show secret meetings between the 2 men, financial arrangements that excluded Uncle Danny, and contingency plans that involved eliminating him as a security risk. The paranoia reached a crescendo in early May, just before my 15th birthday. I was in my usual hiding spot in the coat closet when all 3 men gathered for what would turn out to be their last strategy meeting. "I know what you've been planning," Uncle Danny said without preamble, his voice tight with accusation. "Both of you? You think I'm stupid?" "Danny, what the hell are you talking about?" my father demanded, but there was wariness in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what his brother meant. "I'm talking about the Henderson situation. I'm talking about the Martinez girl. I'm talking about your little side arrangements that somehow never get mentioned in our weekly discussions." Uncle Mike's cold laugh filled the room. "That's rich, coming from you. When were you planning to tell us about your pharmacy connections? Or the special arrangements you've made with some of the families on the north side? Those are legitimate business operations," Uncle Danny protested, but his nervous energy betrayed him. "Unlike some people's romantic entanglements that could bring down everything we've worked for." "Romantic entanglements?" Uncle Mike's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Is that what we're calling it now?" My father tried to play peacemaker, but his efforts only made things worse. "Look, We all have our individual interests. The important thing is maintaining operational security and not stepping on each other's toes. Operational security? Uncle Danny's laugh was bitter. That's a joke. Mike's been documenting everything we do, taking photographs, keeping records. For what purpose, Mike? Why do you need evidence of our activities unless you're planning to use it against us? The same reason you keep your little insurance policy in that box under your bed, Uncle Mike replied smoothly. Protection. The silence that followed was absolute. Even through the closet door, I could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. Uncle Danny's secret weapon was no longer secret. How did you, Uncle Danny began. How did I know about your insurance policy? The same way I know about Robert's, disability fraud, and your prescription drug operation. The same way I know which of us has been planning to disappear with the emergency fund we've been building. My father's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. What emergency fund? And just like that, the alliance that had terrorized our family and dozens of others for nearly a decade began to collapse under the weight of its own corruption and mutual distrust. Tommy and I had spent 3 years carefully orchestrating this moment, planting seeds of suspicion and watering them with strategic revelations and manufactured evidence. But watching it unfold, listening to these 3 men who had once seemed invincible turn on each other with such vicious precision, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 7 years old. Hope. Not hope for rescue or salvation, we'd long since learned that nobody was coming to save us. But hope for justice. Hope for an ending to their reign of terror. Hope that maybe, just maybe, monsters could be defeated by their own monstrous nature. The meeting ended with threats, accusations, and ultimatums. They agreed to maintain their arrangement for the sake of mutual protection, but everyone in that room knew the partnership was finished. What they didn't know was that their real enemies weren't each other. They were 2 children who had learned to be more patient, more strategic, and more ruthless than any of them had ever imagined possible, and our real plan was just beginning. The summer I turned 16 changed everything. Not because the abuse stopped, it didn't. Not because our mother suddenly became aware of what was happening under her own roof. She remained as oblivious as ever. What changed was that Tommy and I finally had the resources and maturity to execute the most dangerous phase of our plan, escape. But this wasn't going to be a simple matter of running away. We'd spent too many years documenting crimes and gathering evidence to simply disappear into the night. We had obligations now, to the 43 children whose names were written in Uncle Danny's insurance document, to the families who didn't, even know their children had been victimized, and to our own future selves who would need closure and justice. Our escape plan had 3 phases, each more complex and risky than the last. Phase 1 was what we called the documentation exodus. Over the course of 6 months, we needed to systematically remove every piece of evidence from our hiding places and transfer it to a location where we could access it even after leaving Millfield. This meant finding a way to digitize photographs, copy documents, and create multiple backup sets of everything we'd collected over the years. Tommy had solved the technical challenges with typical ingenuity. Through his friendship with Marcus Webb, the son of the town's only lawyer, Tommy had gained access to the law office's copying machine after hours. Marcus, who was the same age as Tommy and completely unaware of why we needed such extensive copying services, thought we were working on some kind of elaborate school project about local history. "You guys are really dedicated to this genealogy assignment," Marcus said one evening as Tommy fed another stack of documents through the machine. "Most kids would have given up weeks ago." "We're thorough," Tommy replied with the kind of innocent smile that had served us well over the years. "Our teacher says thoroughness is the key to good research." While Tommy handled document reproduction, I focused on the more dangerous task of expanding our evidence collection. With the 3 men now actively suspicious of each other, their operational security had become both tighter and more erratic. They were being more careful about some things while becoming reckless about others. Uncle Mike, convinced that Uncle Danny was planning to betray him, had started keeping his own insurance files, but his paranoia made him sloppy. He hid documents in places that were obvious to anyone who knew how to look. I found financial records in his car's spare tire compartment, photographs in a shoebox under his bed, and most damaging of all, a detailed client list tucked inside a hollowed-out book on his shelf. Uncle Danny's nervous energy had reached new heights. He'd started drinking more heavily, which made him talkative in dangerous ways. During one of his alcohol-fueled rants, I overheard him on the phone with someone he called the contact in Pittsburgh, discussing arrangements for relocating merchandise and expanding the customer base. It took me several days to understand that he was talking about trafficking children to buyers in other cities. My father had become the most paranoid of all. He'd started sleeping with a loaded shotgun beside his bed and had installed multiple locks on every door in the house. But his paranoia was focused on external threats. He never imagined that his greatest enemies were already inside his home, carefully documenting his every move. The intelligence we gathered during this period was the most damaging yet. We learned about a network of buyers and sellers that extended across 3 states. We discovered that several missing children from neighboring towns hadn't run away as reported. They'd been sold to collectors who specialized in particular types of victims. We found evidence of corruption that reached into the local police department, the county prosecutor's office, and even the state social services agency. Phase 2 of our plan was the financial disruption. If we were going to escape and survive on our own, we needed money. But more importantly, we needed to cut off the financial pipeline that funded their operation and motivated their crimes. Tommy had identified 17 different revenue streams that supported their activities. Some were legitimate but fraudulent, like my father's disability payments and Uncle Danny's prescription drug sales. Others were directly criminal, payments from buyers, profits from trafficking, and money extorted from victims' families who paid for silence. Our strategy was to systematically sabotage each revenue stream without creating obvious connections that would point back to us. We started with the easiest targets, the fraudulent government benefits and illegal side businesses that could be disrupted with anonymous tips to the appropriate agencies. I spent weeks learning how to use the library's computers to send untraceable emails to fraud investigation units, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement tip lines. Each message was carefully crafted to seem like it came from a concerned citizen who had noticed suspicious activities, rather than someone with inside knowledge of specific crimes. The results exceeded our expectations. Within 2 months, my father's disability payments were suspended pending investigation. Uncle Danny's prescription drug operation was shut down after an unexpected inspection of the pharmacy's inventory. Uncle Mike's construction side business was hit with safety violations and licensing problems that effectively put him out of operation. But the real stroke of genius came from Tommy's observation about their money laundering operation. The 3 men had been using my mother's bank account to process payments that couldn't be deposited directly into their own accounts. They'd convinced her that she was helping with consulting fees for work my father did for various construction companies. Tommy figured out how to access my mother's bank records and discovered patterns that would be obvious to any forensic accountant. Large cash deposits followed by immediate withdrawals, always in round numbers, always on specific days of the week. It was a textbook money laundering operation, and my mother's signature was on every transaction. "What if Mom got arrested for money laundering?" Tommy asked during one of our planning sessions. "What would happen to us?" It was a question that had been bothering me for weeks. Our mother wasn't innocent. She had to know that something strange was happening with her bank account, but she wasn't one of the monsters either. She was a victim of a different kind, broken down by years of abuse and manipulation until she couldn't recognize obvious criminal activity happening under her nose. "Foster care," I replied honestly. "We'd be separated, placed in different families, probably in different cities." Unless we were already emancipated minors with our own resources and a plan for independent living, Tommy said thoughtfully. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. If we could establish legal independence before triggering the financial investigation that would destroy our parents, we could avoid the foster care system entirely. But emancipation required proof of financial stability, evidence of mature decision-making, and sponsorship from responsible adults. That's when I remembered Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez. Mrs. Vasquez was our high school's guidance counselor, a kind woman, in her 50s who had immigrated from Mexico as a teenager and worked her way through college and graduate school. She'd noticed my academic potential despite my erratic attendance and emotional problems, and had been encouraging me to think about college applications. More importantly, Mrs. Vasquez had experience with emancipation cases. She'd helped several students escape abusive households through legal channels, and she understood the complicated intersection of family law, social services, and educational planning. Approaching Mrs. Vasquez required careful planning. I couldn't tell her the whole truth, not yet, but I needed to give her enough information to understand why Tommy and I needed help, without revealing details that would force her to contact authorities before we were ready. Mrs. Vasquez, I said after staying behind one day after our weekly guidance meeting, I need to ask you about something hypothetical. She raised an eyebrow, the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard this opening line before. Hypothetical? Questions about real situations? Maybe, I admitted. If someone wanted to become an emancipated minor and they had a younger sibling they wanted to protect, what would be the best way to approach that situation? Mrs. Vasquez studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her processing not just my words but my body language, my tone, and all the subtle signs that had probably been obvious to her for months. This hypothetical person, she said carefully, would they have safe places to live and reliable sources of income? They might, if they planned carefully enough. And the younger sibling, would this person want to become emancipated too, or would they prefer to remain with the hypothetical older sibling as a guardian? It was exactly the right question, the one that proved Mrs. Vasquez understood the real situation without forcing me to admit anything explicitly. The second option, I said. Definitely the second option. Mrs. Vasquez nodded slowly. Well, this hypothetical person would need to document their ability to support themselves and their sibling. They'd need proof of income, a suitable living, arrangement, and evidence that they could make mature decisions about education, healthcare, and other important matters. And if this person had information about why the current living situation was unsuitable, that information would need to be presented very carefully with proper legal representation and appropriate timing. Sometimes it's better to establish independence first and address other issues afterward, when everyone involved has more options and protection. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Mrs. Vasquez understood. She was willing to help. And most importantly, she was suggesting the same approach Tommy and I had already planned. Establish our independence first, then use our evidence to seek justice for ourselves and the other victims. This hypothetical person, I said, might need someone to vouch for their character and maturity during the legal process. I imagine this hypothetical person would have no trouble finding references, Mrs. Vasquez replied with a slight smile. Especially if they demonstrated the same kind of intelligence and determination in their emancipation planning that they've shown in their academic work. Phase 3 of our plan was the final exit. Once we had our evidence secured and our legal independence established, we would trigger a cascade of investigations and revelations that would destroy the 3 men who had controlled our lives for so long. But we wouldn't just disappear and let justice take its course. We had learned too much about the system's failures, about the corruption that protected predators and the indifference that abandoned victims. We needed to ensure that this time, the truth would be heard and acted upon. That meant finding the right journalist, the right prosecutor, the right combination of media attention and legal pressure to guarantee that our evidence wouldn't be buried or dismissed. It meant timing our revelations to coincide with other investigations, creating a perfect storm of scrutiny that would be impossible to weather or deflect. Most importantly, it meant accepting that once we set this plan in motion, there would be no going back. We would be committed to seeing it through to the end, no matter what the personal cost. But after 9 years of systematic abuse, after discovering the scope of their crimes against dozens of other children, after watching them operate with impunity, while the adults who should have protected us remained oblivious or complicit, Tommy and I were ready for that commitment. We were ready to stop being victims and start being the architects of justice. The summer I turned 16, we began the final preparations for a plan that would take 20 more years to reach its ultimate conclusion. But every day of those 20 years would be worth it for the moment when their entire world came crashing down around them. Everything changed on October 15th, 1975. I remember the exact date because it was the day Tommy turned 13, and it was the day we discovered that our carefully laid plans might not be moving fast enough to save everyone who needed saving. The discovery came through Jenny Martinez, the girl from Tommy's class whose father had died in the mill accident 2 years earlier. Jenny had been one of Uncle Danny's victims, though we'd never been able to get close enough to her to offer help or gather testimony. She was too scared, too isolated, and too well trained in the art of keeping dangerous secrets. But on Tommy's birthday, Jenny approached him after school with a desperation that overrode her usual caution. "Tommy," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "I need to talk to you. About your uncle. About what he does to kids like us." Tommy's blood ran cold. In all our years of planning and evidence gathering, we'd managed to keep our activities completely separate from our identities as potential victims. As far as anyone in town knew, Tommy and I were just ordinary kids dealing with typical family problems. The idea that someone might have connected us to Uncle Danny's crimes was terrifying. "I don't know what you mean," Tommy replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Yes, you do," Jenny insisted, her dark eyes filled with tears she was fighting to hold back. "I've been watching you and Maggie for months. The way you both act around your uncles, the way you avoid being alone with them, the way you both get that same scared look when they're around. You know exactly what I mean." That afternoon, Tommy brought Jenny to our oak tree meeting spot. It was a violation of every security protocol we'd established, but Jenny's situation had reached a crisis point that demanded immediate action. "He's planning to sell me," Jenny said without preamble, her 13-year-old voice carrying a matter-of-factness. That was heartbreaking. "Uncle Danny told my mom that he knows a family in Pittsburgh who wants to adopt a girl my age. A family that would pay good money for the right kind of arrangement." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. We'd discovered evidence of trafficking in Uncle Danny's records, but it had always seemed like something that happened to other children in other places. The reality that it was about to happen to someone we knew, someone sitting right in front of us, made everything suddenly urgent and personal in a way our long-term planning hadn't accounted for. "When?" I asked. "This weekend. There's a man coming to town on Saturday to meet me. Mom thinks it's just an interview for a potential adoption, but I heard Uncle Danny on the phone. This man already paid half the money up front." Tommy and I exchanged looks. Saturday was 3 days away. 3 days to prevent a 13-year-old girl from being sold to predators who would destroy whatever innocence Uncle Danny had left intact. "We have to stop it," Tommy said, his voice carrying the same determination that had sustained us through years of planning. "We can't let this happen." But stopping it meant accelerating our timeline dramatically. We weren't ready for Phase 3. We hadn't established our legal independence. We hadn't secured all our evidence. We hadn't identified the right journalist or prosecutor to ensure our revelations would be taken seriously. "If we act now, we might not be able to protect the other victims," I pointed out, though the words felt like poison in my mouth. "We might save Jenny, but lose the chance to bring down the whole network. And if we don't act now, Jenny disappears forever, Tommy replied. How do we live with that? It was the kind of impossible choice that shouldn't exist in the world, but which had defined our lives for as long as we could remember. Save one person we could help immediately, or continue working toward justice for dozens of people we might be able to help eventually. Jenny made the decision for us. I'm not going to Pittsburgh, she said with quiet finality. I'd rather die first. And if you don't help me stop this, I'm going to tell everyone in town exactly what your uncle has been doing to me and what your father and other uncle have been doing to other kids. I don't care if nobody believes me. I don't care if it gets me killed. I'm not going to disappear quietly. The threat wasn't emotional manipulation. It was a statement of fact. Jenny had reached the point where any action, no matter how dangerous, was preferable to passive acceptance of her fate. If we didn't help her, she was going to create chaos that would destroy not just Uncle Danny, but potentially our entire long-term strategy. Okay, I said finally. We'll stop it. But we need to be smart about this. We need to make sure that when we act, we don't just save you. We begin the process that saves everyone. What followed were the most intense 72 hours of our lives. We had to compress months of careful planning into a weekend, improvising solutions to problems we'd expected to have weeks or months to solve. Tommy reached out to Mrs. Vasquez, using the story that our family situation had suddenly become dangerous, and we needed immediate help with emergency emancipation procedures. Mrs. Vasquez, to her eternal credit, didn't ask for details she didn't need to know. She simply began making phone calls to lawyers, social workers, and family court judges who specialized in crisis situations. I focused on documentation and evidence. If we were going to trigger investigations prematurely, we needed to make sure our evidence package was comprehensive enough to withstand scrutiny and organized enough to be immediately actionable. I spent 2 straight nights converting our years of collected materials into a formal presentation that would make sense to law enforcement and prosecutors. But our most important ally turned out to be Marcus Webb's father, attorney David Webb. When Mrs. Vasquez explained that she had students in immediate danger who needed legal protection, Mr. Webb agreed to meet with us on an emergency basis. The meeting took place on Friday evening in Mr. Webb's law office, the same building where Tommy had been copying documents for months. Mrs. Vasquez had prepared Mr. Webb for the possibility that what we were about to tell him would be difficult to hear, but I don't think anything could have prepared him for the scope of what we revealed. How long have you been gathering this evidence? Mr. Webb asked after Tommy and I had spent an hour walking him through our documentation. 6 years, I replied, since I was 11 and Tommy was 8. Mr. Webb was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs, documents, and recorded testimonies we'd assembled. He was a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a reputation for taking on difficult cases other lawyers avoided. But even his extensive experience with family law and child protection hadn't prepared him for anything like this. This evidence, he said finally. It's enough to put all 3 men away for life. Multiple life sentences, actually. But presenting it is going to require very careful coordination with law enforcement and social services. We know, Tommy said. That's why we need emancipation first. If we're going to be the primary witnesses against our own family members, we need legal protection that doesn't depend on the same system that failed to notice this was happening for years. Mr. Webb nodded slowly. Smart thinking. But emancipation? Procedures typically take weeks or months, and you're telling me this girl needs protection immediately. Jenny isn't the only one, I said, pulling out the list of names we'd compiled from Uncle Danny's insurance document. There are at least a dozen other children in active danger right now. If we can prevent Jenny's trafficking and simultaneously begin the legal process that protects the others, we might be able to save everyone. What exactly are you proposing? Tommy and I had spent the previous night working out the details of what we were calling the cascade strategy. Instead of gradually exposing the three men's crimes, we would trigger multiple simultaneous investigations from different agencies, creating a crisis so complex and urgent that it couldn't be covered up or dismissed. We want to report the attempted trafficking to the FBI, I explained. Human trafficking across state lines is a federal crime that triggers mandatory investigation procedures. While they're investigating Jenny's case, we'll provide evidence of the broader network to state and local authorities. And we want to do it all while establishing our legal independence, Tommy added, so we can serve as protected witnesses rather than dependent minors who might be placed in custody or foster care. Mr. Webb studied us for another long moment, and I could see him processing not just our plan, but the reality of what we'd endured and overcome. 2 children who had survived years of systematic abuse had educated themselves in law enforcement, procedures, federal crime classifications, and witness protection protocols. We'd done it out of necessity, because the adults who should have protected us had failed so completely that we'd been forced to become our own advocates. "This is going to change your lives forever," Mr. Webb said finally. "Once you start this process, there's no going back to being anonymous kids in a small town. You'll be witnesses in federal criminal cases. Your names will be in court records and newspaper articles. Everyone in Millfield will know what happened to you." "Good," I replied. "Maybe if everyone knows what happened to us, it won't happen to other kids." Mr. Webb smiled for the first time since our meeting had begun. "All right, let's save some children." Saturday morning, instead of being interviewed by a potential buyer from Pittsburgh, Jenny Martinez was sitting in a federal building in Pittsburgh, providing testimony to FBI agents about a human trafficking operation that spanned 3 states. By noon, arrest warrants had been issued for Uncle Danny, the buyer who had traveled from Pittsburgh, and 3 other men who had been identified as part of the trafficking network. By Saturday evening, Uncle Danny was in federal custody. Uncle Mike had been arrested on state charges related to his documented crimes, and my father had barricaded himself in our house with his shotgun, screaming threats at the police officers who surrounded the building. Tommy and I watched it all unfold, from Mrs. Vasquez's living room, where we'd been placed in protective custody while our emancipation paperwork was processed. For the first time in our lives, we were safe. For the first time in 6 years, we weren't planning or scheming or documenting. We were just watching justice happen. But even as we celebrated this victory, we knew it was only the beginning. The bye. 3 men who had terrorized our childhood were finally facing consequences, but the network they'd built was larger than just them. The corruption that had enabled their crimes ran deeper than just our town. The system that had failed 43 children needed more than arrest to become trustworthy. Our long-term plan had been compressed into a single weekend, but our long-term mission was just beginning. Over the next 20 years, we would dedicate our lives to making sure that what happened to us could never happen to anyone else. And when that mission was finally complete, our revenge would be more perfect than anything we could have imagined as children hiding under an oak tree, dreaming of justice. The trials began 18 months later, and they lasted for 3 years. 3 years of testimony, cross-examinations, appeals, and media coverage that turned our small town of Millfield into a symbol of institutional failure and childhood trauma that resonated across the entire country. By then, Tommy and I were legally emancipated minors living in a small apartment in Pittsburgh, supported by victim compensation funds and part-time jobs that worked around our court schedules. I was 17, finishing high school through an accelerated program while simultaneously auditing college courses in criminal justice and psychology. Tommy, at 14, had tested into advanced placement classes and was already talking about law school. We had become something unprecedented in the legal system. Child victims who were also the primary investigators and coordinators of their own case. The evidence we'd gathered over 6 years had been so comprehensive and well-organized that federal prosecutors called it the most thoroughly documented abuse case in modern legal history. But the trials themselves were just the beginning of our real revenge. Uncle Danny was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The trafficking charges alone would have kept him locked up forever, but the federal prosecutors wanted to send a message about the systematic nature of his crimes. Each life sentence represented a different category of victim: children under 10, children aged 10 to 14, trafficking victims, and what they called institutional victims: children who had been abused through his connections to schools, hospitals, and social services. Uncle Mike received 3 life sentences plus 85 years. His cold, methodical approach to abuse had created the most extensive documentation trail, and his client list had revealed connections to buyers in 7 different states. During his sentencing hearing, the judge called him a calculating predator who treated children like commodities in a business transaction. My father's case was more complicated. The standoff at our house had ended with him suffering a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. His lawyers argued that his medical condition made him unfit for trial, but the prosecution had built such an overwhelming case that the court proceedings continued anyway. Robert Thompson was sentenced to life in prison, but due to his medical condition, he was housed in a federal medical facility that was part prison, part long-term care ward. He would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair, unable to speak in complete sentences, dependent on others for basic care, and surrounded by constant reminders that he was a convicted child abuser. For most people, seeing all 3 men locked away forever would have felt like complete justice. But Tommy and I had learned something important during our years of planning and evidence gathering. Individual punishment wasn't enough to prevent future crimes. The system that had enabled these men to operate for so long was still intact, still vulnerable to the next generation of predators. Our real revenge wasn't just destroying the men who had hurt us. Our real revenge was rebuilding the system so that no other children would have to become their own investigators and advocates. The first part of this mission began during the trials themselves. The media attention generated by our case had attracted the interest of investigative journalists, child advocacy organizations, and federal agencies that specialized in systemic reform. They all wanted to understand how 3 men had been able to abuse 43 children over nearly a decade without being detected or stopped. Tommy and I became consultants for these investigations, sharing not just our evidence, but our insights into the patterns of behavior, institutional blind spots, and communication failures that had made the crimes possible. We worked with teams of experts to develop new training protocols for teachers, social workers, healthcare providers, and law enforcement officers. The problem isn't that the signs weren't there, I explained during one session with state education officials. The problem is that the people who were supposed to recognize the signs weren't trained to see patterns across multiple families and multiple institutions. Tommy had become particularly focused on the technology aspects of abuse prevention. Even at 14, he understood that the evidence-gathering techniques we'd developed could be systematized and taught to other potential victims, giving them tools to document crimes and protect themselves in ways that previous generations had never been able to access. Children are natural observers, Tommy told a conference of child psychologists. We notice things adults miss because we're not distracted by social conventions and professional boundaries. The question is how to create safe channels for children to report what they observe without putting them at additional risk. The second part of our mission was more personal and took much longer to accomplish. We wanted to help the other victims, the 43 children whose names had been on Uncle Danny's list, plus the additional victims who came forward after the trials began. Some of these children were easy to help. Their families were supportive, they had access to good therapy and medical care, and they were able to process their trauma with appropriate professional support. But others were dealing with family situations almost as complicated as ours had been, where the adults who should have protected them were either complicit or in denial about what had happened. For these children, Tommy and I created what we called the network, an informal support system that connected young survivors, with resources, legal advocacy, and peer counseling. We trained older survivors to mentor younger ones, developed communication systems that allowed isolated children to get help safely, and created documentation protocols that could be used by children who might someday need evidence for their own legal proceedings. Mrs. Vasquez, who had remained one of our closest allies throughout the entire process, helped us formalize the network into a legitimate nonprofit organization when I turned 18. By then, we were working with families in 12 different states, and we had created resource materials that were being used by child advocacy organizations across the country. You two have turned your worst experiences into tools for helping others, Mrs. Vasquez told us during the nonprofit's incorporation ceremony. That's not just healing, that's transformation. But even as we celebrated these victories, Tommy and I knew that our work was incomplete. The 3 men who had destroyed our childhood were locked away forever, but the broader network they'd been part of was still operating. The buyers in Pittsburgh and other cities were still purchasing children from other suppliers. The corrupt officials who had ignored obvious warning signs were still in positions of authority. Our long-term revenge required patience and strategic thinking that extended far beyond individual prosecutions. When I was 19 and Tommy was 16, we made a decision that would define the next phase of our lives. We were going to pursue careers that would give us the authority and resources to systematically dismantle the infrastructure that enabled child trafficking and abuse. I enrolled in a joint degree program that would give me both a law degree and a master's in social work, with specializations in victim advocacy and federal criminal law. My goal was to become a federal prosecutor who specialized in crimes against children, with the institutional knowledge and personal motivation to pursue cases that other attorneys might find too complex or time-consuming. Tommy chose a different path that was equally strategic. He enrolled in computer science and forensic accounting programs, with the goal of becoming a specialist in tracking financial crimes and digital evidence related to child exploitation. His photographic memory and pattern recognition skills made him extraordinarily effective at identifying connections that other investigators missed. "We're playing a 20-year game," Tommy explained to a journalist who was writing a follow-up story about our case. "Individual prosecutions are important, but system change requires people who understand both the legal mechanisms and the technological tools that criminals use to hide their activities." The journalist was surprised by the sophistication of our long-term planning. Most trauma survivors focus on healing and moving forward. You two seem focused on prevention and systemic change. Isn't that an unusual approach to recovery? "Recovery and prevention aren't separate goals," I replied. "We can't fully heal until we know that other children are safe. And we can't make other children safe without changing the systems that failed to protect us." By the time I graduated from law school and Tommy finished his undergraduate degrees, we had spent 8 years building expertise, credibility, and professional networks that positioned us to begin the most ambitious phase of our revenge plan. We were no longer victims, seeking justice for past crimes. We had become professionals with the skills, authority, and institutional access to prevent future crimes on a scale that individual prosecutions could never achieve. The real test of our strategy came when I was 26 and Tommy was 23. We had both been working in our respective fields for several years, I as a federal prosecutor specializing in organized child exploitation cases, Tommy as a forensic analyst for a federal task force that tracked financial crimes related to human trafficking. That's when we learned that a network with connections to our original case was operating in the Pacific Northwest, using methods and technologies that were far more sophisticated than anything we'd encountered in Pennsylvania. The organization was led by a man named Marcus Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had built what appeared to be a legitimate software company, but was actually the technological backbone for trafficking operations across the western United States. Chen's operation was everything our childhood tormentors had been, but amplified by modern technology and international connections that made prosecution almost impossible using traditional law enforcement methods. This is what we've been preparing for, Tommy told me during a secure phone call after he'd finished analyzing Chen's financial networks. This is the case that will prove whether our approach actually works on a large scale. I agreed. Marcus Chen's organization represented everything we'd learned to recognize and fight against. Systematic abuse hidden behind legitimate businesses, technological sophistication that stayed ahead of law enforcement capabilities, and political connections that provided protection from serious investigation. If we could bring down Chen's network using the methods we'd developed, we would prove that our approach could scale up to address the most complex and well-protected criminal organizations. If we failed, we would have to accept that some forms of organized abuse were simply too powerful to be defeated by individual effort and institutional reform. The Chen investigation would take us 3 years to complete, and it would require us to push our skills, resources, and personal relationships to their absolute limits. But when it was over, we would have accomplished something that nobody thought was possible: the complete dismantling of a criminal organization that had seemed untouchable. And that would be when our revenge finally felt complete. The Marcus Chen investigation began on a rainy Tuesday morning in Seattle, when a 12-year-old girl named Amy Liu walked into a police station and told officers that her uncle was selling photographs of children to people on the internet. What she described sounded like a typical family abuse case until digital forensics experts discovered that her uncle's computer contained terabytes of data connected to an international trafficking network. That's when they called Tommy. By then, Tommy had developed a reputation as the federal analyst who could trace financial patterns and digital evidence through the most complex criminal organizations. His work had led to the dismantling of 14 separate trafficking rings over the previous 5 years, and his techniques were being taught to investigators across the country. But the Chen case was different. When Tommy began analyzing the digital evidence from Amy Liu's uncle's computer, he discovered that they weren't dealing with a simple family exploitation case or even a typical trafficking ring. They had uncovered the technological infrastructure for what appeared to be the most sophisticated child exploitation network in North American history. This isn't just about selling individual children or producing specific content, Tommy explained to me during our first case conference. Chen's organization has created a platform that connects buyers, sellers, and service providers across multiple countries. It's like Amazon, but for child exploitation. The technical complexity was staggering. Chen's legitimate software company provided encryption services, secure communication platforms, and digital payment systems to hundreds of apparently legal businesses. But hidden within this infrastructure was a parallel network that facilitated every aspect of child trafficking: victim identification and recruitment, secure communication between criminals, untraceable financial transactions, and even logistics. Coordination for transporting children across international borders. They've solved every operational problem that traditional trafficking organizations struggle with, I told my federal prosecutor colleagues during our first strategy meeting. Secure communications, financial anonymity, international coordination, and technological security that stays ahead of law enforcement capabilities. This organization represents evolution in criminal sophistication. What made the case even more challenging was Chen's legitimate profile. He was a respected entrepreneur who had been featured on magazine covers and gave speeches at technology conferences about innovation and social responsibility. His company employed over 300 people and had been praised by law enforcement agencies for developing security tools that helped protect children online. The cognitive dissonance was intentional. Chen had built his criminal enterprise inside a legitimate business that actually did develop real tools for child protection. His encryption software was genuinely used by schools and families to protect children from online predators, while simultaneously being used by his criminal clients to exploit children with complete anonymity. He's not just hiding behind a legitimate business, Tommy observed during one of our analysis sessions. He's actively contributing to child protection efforts as cover for his criminal activities. That's not just sophisticated. It's psychologically sophisticated. The investigation required resources and coordination beyond anything either of us had worked on before. The FBI assigned a task force of 37 agents across 12 cities. International law enforcement agencies in Canada, Mexico, and 3 European countries agreed to coordinate simultaneous operations. Technology companies provided technical expertise to help us understand systems that were more advanced than anything in law enforcement's standard toolkit. But the most important resource was something that couldn't be assigned or coordinated: the specific expertise Tommy and I had developed during our childhood. We understood the psychology of systematic abuse in ways that even experienced investigators couldn't fully grasp. We recognized patterns of behavior and institutional manipulation that others missed. Most importantly, we understood how abusers thought about long-term planning and risk management. Chen's biggest vulnerability isn't technical, I realized 6 months into the investigation. It's psychological. He's built this organization using the same fundamental assumptions about power and control that our father and uncles used. He believes that children can't be effective adversaries, that victims won't organize strategically, and that institutional authority will protect him from consequences. Tommy nodded, seeing immediately where my analysis was leading. He's not prepared for opponents who understand his psychology because they survived it themselves. That insight led to the breakthrough that made the entire case possible. Instead of trying to penetrate Chen's organization from the outside, we created a strategy that exploited the same psychological blind spots that had made our childhood adversaries vulnerable to manipulation. We began by identifying other survivors within Chen's organization, adults who had been victimized as children and were now working for Chen's legitimate business, unaware that their employer was operating a criminal network. Using techniques we'd developed through the network, we created secure communication channels that allowed these survivors to share information without exposing themselves to retaliation. What we discovered was that Chen's organization included dozens of trauma survivors who had been strategically recruited because their backgrounds made them particularly skilled at understanding victim psychology and institutional vulnerabilities. Chen had been exploiting survivors' expertise to make his criminal operations more effective, while keeping them unaware of the larger context of their work. It's the same pattern we saw in Pennsylvania, Tommy observed. Abusers don't just destroy individual victims. They turn survivors into unwitting accomplices by giving them legitimate roles that feel like healing or purpose. Once we understood this psychological infrastructure, we could begin dismantling it systematically. We provided Chen's survivor employees with evidence of how their legitimate work was being used to facilitate crimes against children. We connected them with therapists and legal advocates who understood the complex emotions involved in discovering that recovery efforts had been manipulated for criminal purposes. Most importantly, we helped them understand that exposing Chen's crimes wasn't betraying their employer. It was completing their own healing process by ensuring that their skills and expertise would be used to protect children rather than exploit them. The psychological campaign was more effective than any traditional law enforcement technique could have been. Within 18 months, we had created a network of informants who provided intelligence from inside Chen's organization. They gave us access to financial records, communication logs, client lists, and operational procedures that would have taken years to discover through external investigation. But the real power of our approach became clear when we began coordinating the final phase of the operation. Instead of simply gathering evidence for prosecution, we had created a situation where Chen's own employees were actively working to dismantle his criminal network from within. This is what justice looks like when victims become advocates, told Tommy the night before we executed the coordinated arrests. It's not just about punishment, it's about transformation. The operation itself was unprecedented in its scope and coordination. On a single day in March 2014, law enforcement agencies in 4 countries executed simultaneous raids on 127 locations connected to Chen's network. They arrested 89 individuals, rescued 31 children who were in immediate danger, and seized digital evidence that led to the identification of over 400 additional victims. Marcus Chen was arrested at his company's headquarters in Seattle while giving a presentation about technology solutions for child safety to a conference of social workers and law enforcement officers. The irony was so complete that it felt like poetic justice. But the arrests were just the beginning of the final phase of our revenge. Chen's trial became a showcase for everything Tommy and I had learned about using survivor expertise to dismantle systematic abuse. We served as both prosecutors and expert witnesses, explaining to juries how criminal organizations exploited institutional blind spots and psychological vulnerabilities. More importantly, the trial became a platform for demonstrating that survivors could become more effective advocates for justice than traditional law enforcement approaches could achieve alone. Chen was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. His organization was completely dismantled, with assets seized and redistributed to victim compensation funds. The technological infrastructure he'd created was repurposed for legitimate child protection efforts. But the most satisfying aspect of his conviction was psychological rather than legal. During his sentencing hearing, Chen looked directly at Tommy and me and said something that proved we had achieved the perfect revenge. I never imagined that children could be capable of this level of strategic thinking and long-term planning. If I had understood what you were capable of, I would have chosen a different business model entirely. It was an admission that validated everything we had believed since we were children hiding under an oak tree in Pennsylvania. Abusers underestimate their victims because they need to believe that children are powerless. When survivors prove that powerlessness is an illusion, the entire psychological foundation of abuse collapses. Today, 37 years after that first night when my father violated my childhood innocence, I can finally say that our revenge is complete. Not because all the perpetrators are in prison, though they are. Not because all the victims have been saved, though we've saved as many as we could. Our revenge is complete because we proved that survivors can become more powerful than their abusers ever imagined possible. Tommy and I are both in our 50s now. He directs a federal task force that has revolutionized how law enforcement investigates technology-enabled crimes against children. I serve as a federal judge who specializes in cases involving systematic abuse and institutional failure. Together, we've created investigative techniques, legal precedents, and victim advocacy systems that have changed how the justice system responds to crimes against children. The network we started in our teens now operates in all 50 states and 12 countries. It has helped over 3,000 survivors pursue justice, healing, and advocacy careers. Many of those survivors have gone on to create their own organizations, develop new therapeutic approaches, and establish legal protections that didn't exist when we were children. But the most meaningful measure of our success isn't the number of criminals we've prosecuted, or the number of victims we've helped. It's the fact that children today have resources, legal protections, and advocacy systems that make it almost impossible for the kind of systematic abuse we survived to continue undetected for years. We turned our worst experiences into tools for preventing other children from having similar experiences. We used our understanding of abuser psychology to create more effective law enforcement techniques. We transformed our survival skills into professional expertise that changed how institutions respond to child protection concerns. That transformation, from victims to advocates, from powerlessness to systemic influence, from individual trauma to collective healing, that is the perfect revenge. Sometimes people ask me if I ever feel sorry for the men who destroyed my childhood. The answer is no. I feel sorry for the children they hurt, including the children Tommy and I used to be. But I don't feel sorry for the men themselves. They chose to see children as powerless, and in doing so, they created their own destruction. They taught us to be strategic, patient, and ruthlessly effective advocates for justice. They gave us the motivation and expertise we needed to dismantle not just their crimes, but the entire system of institutional failures that made their crimes possible. They thought they were destroying 2 children. Instead, they created 2 of the most effective child advocates in the history of the American justice system. That irony will follow them to their graves, and it will be the foundation of everything good we accomplish for the rest of our lives. And that, my friends, is what perfect revenge looks like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.